Now, when Yeshua saw the crowds, he went up on a high mountain. And when he went up on the high mountain, he sat. And then his disciples came to him. And this is the point of the Sermon on the Mount, what we famously know as the Sermon on the Mount. But what did he really mean when they sat on a high mountain and gathered his disciples? Shalom, everyone. I'm Dr. Dina Dye, and we are going through the book of Matthew, looking at it as a pattern of the Exodus. The message here is, what did Jesus mean? Not so much what did he do, but what did he mean by the things he said and by the actions he took? And we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, probably the most famous narrative in all of Scripture. But there's a lot in that narrative that we miss because we don't understand the terms, how the ancients viewed things such as the mountain. Mountains in the ancient world had a completely different understanding than they do for us today. So in order to understand what he was doing on the mountain, we've got to talk about mountains. So in the ancient world, mountains were seen as sort of a cosmic place, the place of the place of creation. Life came forth, was associated with the mountain. That's because when you had water and the water separated and the dry ground appeared, the dry ground, if you will, would rise up and turn into a mountain. That's just how they looked at it. So mountains became a place, the source of life. Mountains were the place that connected heaven, earth, and sea. So you can see this right out of the gate in Genesis chapter 1. We see this when the children of Israel at Sinai and they're receiving the commandments. On the fourth day, it talks about God's sovereignty over heaven, earth, and sea. And heaven, earth, and sea basically represented the three domains or the three levels or courtyards if you had in a temple. So the mountain was the home to the deity or the god, and on top of the mountain, as I've mentioned before, that's where they located the temple. And inside the temple was the throne room for the deity. Eventually, the king would be given his place in that environment when the temple became a fixed object. But the mountain was considered the fixed spot. And the mountain, the solidity, the stability, the permanence of the mountain came to represent government. It was the place for the ancient world, the center of power. Now, those powers were associated with the powers of chaos. And the mountain was supposed to be a refuge from the chaos, from the empires. In actuality, they looked at the mountain as sort of the bulwark, if you will, against the adversary. And adversaries were associated with the rulers of foreign empires. So we see, of course, Moses being a great example of the one who is on the mountain, in the cloud, in the presence of God. The top of the mountain seen as like a temple, Mount Sinai, with the sapphire paving stones in the presence of God. The temple was the home to the god, the top of it was. And so in ancient Mesopotamia, they didn't have mountains, so they would build imitation mountains we called ziggurats. But again, the throne of the king was on top of the mountain, and it was when the king was seated on the throne that order came to the empire. And it was on top of the mountain, and we've mentioned before that Moses received the Edut, or the tablets of destiny, what we call the Torah, the governing documents for the nation. So Mount Sinai associated with Moses and the Torah, and now we have, in essence, a fulfillment of the Torah of Yeshua sitting. Whenever we see him sitting on a mountain, that should speak to us about kingship, that he's taken his seat on top of the mountain, because that's the place where the king sat to govern. And the kingdom was governed from the mountain. That was where the king's throne was. The deity and humanity meet in communion on the cosmic mountain for a mutual act of worship and creation. And so the temple on the mountain, being the place where heaven and earth unite, where heaven and earth come together, is the place where worship happens, where one worships the king. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but if we go back to Eden, the garden in Eden is really what it is. And Eden was seen as a cosmic mountain or a mountain-type temple. And so it was everything that followed after that pattern. The temple in Eden and the mountain, Noah's ark on Ararat, Moses on the mountain and with the portable tabernacle. And we move into finally Mount Moriah, where David is given the blueprints for the temple. Solomon is the one who builds the temple. So we go back to Eden. This is speaking of the mountain of God. So there was a mountain of God, and that was a special place because that is where God ruled and reigned from. The mountain, they call it in the ancient world the Axis Mundi. It held heaven and earth and the underworld together. And again, the temple of the Creator, it was a temple of the Creator God. Now, they had creator gods, the ancients did in their world. Again, they would build on top of the mountain. So it was a sacred space. It was a sacred place, and it was home to the divinity. And so that becomes very, very important. Cosmic mountains were traditionally situated above the primordial waters. We see this in creation, which in an orderly cosmos became the source of the sacred rivers that watered the four quarters of the earth. So this was very common in the ancient world. This is how they thought. In mountains and rivers and water, and where the birth of creation comes from. So anytime you see Yeshua doing something on a mountain, you need to take note, because it's communicating something. There's some sort of recreation element in it, because the mountain was supposed to be the place of refuge from the powers of chaos. And so again, we see Yeshua sitting on a mountain, delivering the Beatitudes to his people. Again, a replay of what Moses did, receiving the tablets of stone and communicating the Torah to his people. Yeshua is communicating the Beatitudes to his people. They are now the fulfillment, if you will, the governing documents of the kingdom of heaven on earth. And again, all of this functions in a similar way. Just as an aside, the altar that was in the temple functioned also as a cosmic mountain. It was designed to look like a mountain. And so even with the altar, the top of the altar itself was called the mountain of God, which is interesting. And the top of the altar, they called the Ariel, or the Lion of God. There was there was a middle layer, a level of the altar, and then the bottom of the altar, they called it the bosom of the earth. And they thought of it as restraining the seas. So at the underworld, or the bottom of the mountain, the labyrinth, the tomb, the pit, Sheol, all those things were associated with the bottom of the mountain, the third level of heaven, earth, and sea. And of course, that area was outside the sacred space of the mountain. The mountain was a place of creation and the source of all life. And what we'll find is that this idea of a cosmic mountain, if you will, it was basically formed the conceptual backdrop to all of ancient Near East literature. So if we're going to the Bible was written at that period of time, obviously over, many, many centuries. But the idea, it was functioned in the ancient Near East world. So it's up to us to try to understand that world and what they meant. So mountains played a vital role in the environment as the stable place and a place of creative order. Now, what's interesting with the Bible is that it shows the difference between Israel and the other nations, that God had set apart his mountain in order to meet his people. The gods of the ancient world could care less about the people. They enslaved humans to take care of them and provide for them and feed them. God, our God, on the other hand, set apart his mountain as a place to meet with his people and communicate with them and restore a relationship with them as they renewed covenant, etc. And so because of that, there was a special protocol for how one would approach or ascend the mountain. Now, this is a topic all in itself that I don't really have time to go into, but the idea of ascending was certainly for the king to ascend and take his seat on the throne, and also for the people, the priests that were called to ascend and meet with God and mediate between heaven and earth and mediate between God and the people. So this begs the question of probably one of the most puzzling scriptures in the New Testament. I've heard some very strange interpretations of it, but hopefully in light of all this that I've shared in all these previous programs, maybe this will make a little more sense. And we can find this in Matthew and Mark as well, but let's just read this from Mark 11:23 to 25. If someone says to this mountain, "Be taken up and thrown into the sea," and does not doubt in his heart, whatever you pray and ask, believe that you have received it and it will be yours. When you stand praying, if you have anything against anyone, forgive him, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you. So we got to look at this with a whole new light, because remember, mountains are temples. And so the only place where one could receive forgiveness was in the temple. When one went up to the temple, it was as though one entered into heaven, and that was the place of forgiveness. So we got this thing going on about taking down a mountain and throwing it into the sea and not doubting in one's heart. So this concept of prayer, this is bringing forth the kingdom of heaven. Remember I said with the prayers, if you didn't pray for the kingdom, you hadn't prayed at all. So this is all very much temple language. Let me just read this from Revelation 8:8. You're probably familiar with it. The second angel trumpeted, and something like a huge mountain ablaze with fire was thrown into the sea. So a bit of similar imagery here, and now we see this a mountain again being thrown into the sea or cast into the sea. Okay, so the idea is not that you can stand there and sort of conjure up enough faith to move a mountain or throw it into the sea. This is not what it's talking about at all. And it's talking about taking down another empire, another kingdom, because the mountain represented one type of kingdom, and the kingdom of heaven represented its opposing kingdom. And it's about taking down one kingdom and replacing it with God's kingdom. Let's just look quickly at some of the Beatitudes, because Yeshua sat on the mountain, and he with his disciples and those who had gathered, and he is presenting to them on the mountain that represented the place that heaven and earth met, the governing documents, or the foundation for how one would live in the kingdom of heaven on earth. And so it will talk about, the honor of it. And let me just mention the Hebrew word there, ashrei, the joy of. But it really means, the honor of the poor in spirit, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You see, this is all kingdom of heaven language on how to operate that kingdom on earth. How are we supposed to walk in it? The honor of those who mourn, because they will be comforted. The honor of the pure in heart, and they will see God. The honor of the peacemakers, they will be called the sons of God. Remember what I talked about a few programs ago, the highest value in the ancient world, next to things like wisdom and order, was honor. You were in honor or shame position, and everyone strive for honor. So the honor of those who've been brought low, of those who were weak, of those who had no influence came in what we see here is the beatitude. Yeshua said things like, "Don't think that I came to abolish the Torah, the prophets, but rather I came to fulfill it." So what God gave to Moses on the mountain, the Torah, finds its fulfillment in the kingdom of heaven as Yeshua is expressing these beatitudes, these ways in which we are to live on this earth. And we do see a lot of argument. I don't know if I want to get too deep into this, but one of the things after this in chapter 5 is then, as he explains things, one of the great arguments of the first century was over ritual purity versus moral purity. And so moral purity really is kind of in a different camp. So, for example, as we're going through the Beatitudes there from chapter 5 and 6 in Matthew, when the law would be do not murder, we get from the Ten Commandments, but Yeshua is taking it a step further. He's expressing how the kingdom of heaven should operate on earth, and he's saying, don't even be angry with your brother. But again, there's a place to go to deal with that anger, and that would be at the temple. The Ten Commandments talk about not committing adultery. Yeshua goes on, his interpretation, if you will, of it is that don't even have lust in your heart. In terms of divorce, the expression here is not, he doesn't even want any type of sexual immorality. And the context for all of this is that these things brought shame. The shame of adultery, for example, was in that culture was a big deal. That was, you lost all honor and you lived in a world of shame. That was the worst thing that can happen to you. And so with divorce, that would bring shame on the women. Not so much on the men, it brought shame on the women. And Yeshua operated, we don't even appreciate how much he valued women in the first century. And so part of the reason for the no divorce decree, except for sexual immorality, was because he wanted to lift up women. Because a woman who was abandoned through divorce was basically reduced to poverty, and she no longer had any power or wisdom, not wisdom, but she had no power or influence in the culture in which she lived. So he was all about protecting those who had no power and who were reduced to servitude in some way. Those are the ones that he came for. And so he sat on the mount with the Sermon on the Mount, and he sat to explain how the law was supposed to function, how they were supposed to exercise the wisdom of the law of the Torah. It's as though he sat on the mountain as king and judge and explained to them in the same way that Moses explained to them how the Torah was supposed to function at their time. So not committing lust in your heart, or not having anger against your brother, or not divorcing because of adultery, and he did allow for instances of sexual immorality. But this is how the kingdom is supposed to look. These were, if you would we call it the halakha, or the expression or interpretation of how Yeshua thought the kingdom should operate. And the idea here of God's wisdom being poured out on the people at this time on the mountain. And so it's important for us to understand the culture and context of the time, that God works through culture. He doesn't upend the culture. When we make judgments and interpretations on things and put our theologies in a box and raise them up and exalt them, it's as though we're overturning or upending the culture of the time. We must look at that first. We cannot insert our modern meaning into everything without understanding it from how it functioned in the ancient world. And of course, the whole Sermon on the Mount thing with Yeshua and how he's communicating how to walk and how to live is really what we would call the classic way of instruction, Jewish instruction. From Matthew 6:6, it says, when you pray, go into your inner room, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret shall reward you. Pray in this way. We see that. And so the prayer that follows is, I guess, the most famous prayer of all. Our Father who art in heaven. Again, we see the concept of heaven and temple and mountain, and where rulership is extended and sovereignty, and where the kingdom is governed from. And hallowed be his name. We exalt his name because he is the king. We are worshiping him as the king. And your kingdom come. Speaking once again, a prayer for the kingdom to come is in every Jewish prayer, and the context for that was the temple. On earth as it is in heaven. So the two connect. Remember, at the mountain is the place where heaven and earth come together. And so now we are seeing with the priests the mediation between heaven and earth. Give us this day our daily bread, speaking of what we would have in the temple. The priests ate the bread. In fact, on the Shabbat, they would eat the loaves that were inside the holy place on the table of showbread, what we call it. So bread was eaten in that sphere. It was the place of the temple where our debts would be forgiven. So we have every 7th year, there would be a forgiving of debts. And so every 50th year, the Jubilee, we would see a forgiving of debts where everything returned to its original owner. So people did not stay in a permanently impoverished place. And so this whole thing is that we see this prayer of forgiveness. So there are many that think that the Lord's Prayer is a summary, if you will, or an encapsulation of what we call the Amidah, which are the standing prayers that were said in the temple. So once the temple was destroyed, they were unable to go to the altar and service the altar with the burnt offerings, etc. And so the actual act or ceremony became a prayer. It became the fruit of our lips. We call these the Amidah, or the standing prayers, the 18 benedictions. And these developed in exile because, of course, in exile they didn't have a temple and they didn't have an altar, and the ceremonies of the temple obviously were not being exercised. So the Lord's Prayer in some way stands as an abbreviation to that. Again, Jewish prayer is all about the kingdom, every single prayer. If you haven't prayed for the kingdom, you haven't prayed at all. And as I mentioned, forgiveness being found in the temple. So this idea of forgiveness of sins was always associated with the temple. We think about the altar itself as they go through the offering system. The altar, in essence, functioned as a place to confirm the covenant. So every covenant that was made between two parties, blood was shed, blood was applied, and then a meal was eaten. And so what went on in the altar is kind of a ceremony of confirmation of the covenant. And so the blood would be applied to the altar. And the purpose of applying the blood isn't to appease the god and make the god, happy because we just killed something. It's to clean. It's a cleansing agent, like an antiseptic that would clean the altar. And the priests were, of course, the ones that were to apply the blood, but their purpose was, again, to be mediators between heaven and earth. In fact, the altar in the Second Temple had a red line around the middle of it, and so sins against heaven, against God, would be splashed above the red line, and sins against man would be, or the earth would be applied at the underneath the line. Yeshua goes on to say, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will stick by one and look down on the other. You cannot serve God and money. And so you have to remember the environment in which he is in. The temple had become corrupt, especially corrupt around money, which is kind of how that always goes. Once tyrants end up in power, they use and abuse and take advantage and operate under, with extortion and bribery and graft, and you kind of name it. And so he is addressing that right here in the context in chapter 6 of the explanation of how the Sermon on the Mount or the Beatitudes are supposed to function, because wealth and power and ownership of large property, one exercises control, and they would lord it over. I mean, whoever's in power lords it over the other. So we're moving along here into Matthew chapter 7, which continues on with these principles of the kingdom. And really, all of the principles come down to one thing. In the ancient world, the most important thing, not only are we dealing with an honor and shame culture, but we understand that order was of the highest value, and order came by exercising wisdom. So the wisdom contained in the Torah was given to the king in order to rule and to bring order to the empire, order to the kingdom. And really, we have to remember this really isn't all about individuals. It was, in the case of Moses, how to lead a community, how to lead a nation, how to bring social order and avoid chaos. This is ground zero. Every empire in the history of mankind brings order either through the exercise of wisdom, where the king exercises policies that are going to bring social order, etc., or they rule with an iron hand and prevent people from being able to do anything. They either force social order or they exercise social order by applying wisdom and in this case exercising the wisdom that God has given through the Torah and beyond into the Beatitudes. This is really an important point, because we all function in some kind of community, and it has to work. Because if there isn't order in the community and chaos ensues, then everybody is in danger. And so this is between Yeshua and Moses, this is something that becomes very important. And so we'll talk about this a little more next time. We talk about the good tree that produces fruit. This isn't speaking really of individuals. It actually is more or less pointing to how kings are supposed to govern. Look, there's no way to sugarcoat it. When you have a good king sitting on the throne and exercising perfect justice and righteousness and bringing peace, then life is good. Then when there is order in the social order in the community, everybody benefits and everybody is blessed by it. But you got a bad king in power making terrible decisions that are only good for that ruler, that benefit him. Things do not go well in the environment. So this is a principle all through Scripture, all through history. Anyways, we'll pick it up next time, and we'll talk more about the Sermon on the Mount. And thank you for joining me. I'll see you then. Shalom.